Alzheimer's disease or heart disease, it may be 3 or 4 times higher in the next 30 to 40 years because our children and our grandchildren have experienced things like obesity and learning disabilities at a much higher rate than our generation did. If we really want to understand what's happening, particularly to children, we have to capture the entirety of their environment, and that's really what the exposome is.
To see that there's scientists actually paying attention to, if you eat these things, you can actually offset these inevitable exposures.
Certainly see that play out in patients, that it's how you emotionally experience your environment also, can trigger asthma, trigger other conditions.
Hi, listeners. New Frontiers in Functional Medicine has been going strong since 2015. With almost 200 episodes and over 2 million downloads, my goal is to bring you the best minds in functional medicine, epigenetics, and longevity. I want actionable insights for the clinician and non-clinician alike. You can access episode transcripts, summaries, research citations, and more over at drkarafitzgerald.com, where you can also find information about our clinic and sign up for the e-newsletter as well. Thanks for supporting this podcast with your likes and your honest reviews, by sharing this with your colleagues, with your family and friends. Thank you also to our sponsors. These are companies that I trust, that we vet carefully, that we use in clinic practice, and that I use personally. Thanks to our diamond level sponsors. For over 40 years, the foundation of biotics research has been innovation and quality. Their goals remain unchanged: innovative ideas, carefully researched concepts, and product development with advanced analytical and manufacturing techniques. Biotics nutritional products are of superior quality and effectiveness. They are available exclusively to the healthcare provider. Find them at bioticsresearch.com. Precision Analytical, creator of the Dutch test, is launching a new educational program this January. They are offering evidence-based training on key topics like hormone metabolism, interpreting Dutch test results, and therapeutic strategies, including hormone replacement therapy, all aimed at improving patient outcomes. Become a registered provider to gain access to an expansive education hub with ongoing content, including webinars and case studies. Visit dutchtest.com/courses to get started and grow your practice. For over 35 years, patients and clinicians have trusted Integrative Therapeutics for their dedication to quality, potency, and accuracy, and for bringing us exclusive products backed by science. From sourcing premium raw materials to their meticulous manufacturing processes, they prioritize consistency, efficacy, and safety because our patients deserve nothing less. Find them at integrativepro.com. That's integrativepro.com. Thanks to our gold level sponsors. Timeline, fueling cellular energy for a lifetime of healthy aging. Find them at timeline.com. Vibrant Wellness, transformative lab tests for wellness. Find them at vibrant-wellness.com. Hi, everybody. Welcome to New Frontiers in Functional Medicine, where we are interviewing the best minds in functional medicine. And, this particular episode, I am thrilled to be introducing you to Drs. Wright. That's Dr. Rosalind Wright and Dr. Bob Wright. Let me give you their background, and we'll jump into what will undoubtedly be one of our best episodes of the year. Robert O. Wright, MD, MPH, is the Ethel H. Wise Chair of the Department of Environmental Medicine and Climate Science at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Rosalind Wright, MD, MPH, is the Dean of Public Health, Chair of the Department of Public Health, and the Horace W. Goldsmith Professor in Children's Health Research at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai also. And together, they direct the Institute for Climate Change, Environmental Health, and Exposomics. Those of us who've been in the functional medicine space for many years have been thinking about the exposome, and we think about, in our systems model, how environment is influencing our patients' offspring, et cetera, over the course of their life, and how it influences the development of disease. It's just such an honor to be bringing forward the work of these extraordinary individuals. We will list their bibliography. We'll list back to the Institute for Exposomic Research, and we'll just give you as much data as we possibly can. I do want to mention that Dr. Robert Wright, specifically established programming research in growth, obesity, and social stressors. This is the Progress Longitudinal Birth Cohort. He started this in 2007, along with Harvard and the National Institutes of Health of Mexico. It's based in Mexico City, and it has collected health outcome data along with social, geospatial, and chemical exposure data starting from birth to age 18. This is the first study to attempt to comprehensively measure the exposome starting in pregnancy. There are well over 100 publications on this particular data set, and I know more are coming. And then just to talk about Dr. Rosalind Wright, she, among many things, is an internationally recognized expert for her work in environmental exposure assessment, genetics, epigenetics, and psychosocial stress in health outcomes. And she directs the PACER Lab, which specifically assesses biological response systems in pregnant women, infants, and children to better understand health risks. So you can see we've got an awesome podcast in front of us. First of all, Doctors Wright, either of you can pick up this question. I just want to know how you got into focusing on the exposome and the extraordinary accomplishment of starting an institute dedicated to it.
Well, I'm a pediatrician, and I did do a fellowship in medical toxicology many years ago at Boston Children's Hospital, and I used to work in the lead clinic. And at the time, environmental health really was sort of looking at one factor at a time, in this case, lead poisoning. And if you think about what our environment is, it's millions of different exposures. And if we only study one thing at a time, we would have to do a million studies. Also, real life doesn't work that way. I mean, you're not just exposed to lead. Children who are exposed to lead are far more likely to live in poverty. They're far more likely to live in an older house. There's all these other contextual factors that go along with it that really can't be captured by just measuring blood lead. So, in those early days, I realized that if we really want to understand what's happening, particularly to children, we have to capture the entirety of their environment. And that's really what the exposome is. And the exposome really as a field was sort of invented by Dr. Christopher Wilde, who was an epidemiologist at IARC, the International Agency for Research in Cancer in France. And he actually wrote a paper in 2005 where he proposed that the field of environmental health needed to move away from studying just one chemical or one factor at a time and consider the way genomics was being practiced, because this was shortly after the Human Genome Project was completed, and actually try to measure what he coined the term the exposome, all the environmental factors that a person is exposed to from birth to death. And it's been somewhat expanded since that time. I think he was primarily thinking about chemicals, but chemicals, those sorts of exposures don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in different social environments. They happen with different nutritional backgrounds and even genetic backgrounds. So the field has actually grown since those early days. And that's sort of how exposomics became about. And because I was a pediatrician interested in environment, I like this idea of trying to understand the holistic world in which children are actually growing up and developing.
Yes, it's daunting. I want to hear, Rosalind, how you got into it as well, but also a little bit about how did you figure out how to wrap your arms around it?
Yeah. So I've actually trained as a pulmonary critical care physician. So as an intensivist in critical care, and I take care of adults, I'm not a pediatrician. I don't focus on kids for my clinical life. Critical care, I fell in love with critical care because I like putting it all together, systems. So I do like to think big problems and how they all interact from my clinical side. That's just always been very appealing to me. So when I started doing research in medical school and residency. I was doing all molecular biology. I even spent a year at NIH doing that research as part of the Howard Hughes program during medical school. And then I started seeing patients when I came back and did my clinical rotations. And I started, thinking to myself, we really got to put people in this broader holistic perspective to really understand how genes may operate, and that it's really more gene by environment. And then I went after a public health degree and public health training because I thought, well, how do I learn to measure the environment? And that really is what took me to public health school, to think about it from a broader perspective. And I was very interested in lung disease as a pulmonologist, and asthma was a big epidemic at the time, still is problematic, but everybody was trying to focus on what was driving the epidemic of asthma in this country and globally, and particularly vulnerable populations, inner city, lower income, that kind of thing. And we were looking at traditional physical environmental factors: tobacco smoke, dust mite, cockroach, air pollution. And it only explained about 15% of what's going on there. And I've always been interested as well in mind-body connections and the link between psychology and medicine. And certainly see that play out in patients, that it's how you emotionally experience your environment also, can trigger asthma, trigger other conditions. And so I became very interested in, how do I measure that? Well, how do I measure the social environment and how you emotionally respond to that? And to me, the stress health paradigm, and how just as you breathe in an air pollutant or a dust mite allergen, and it revs up your immune system and other systems in your body, other neurotransmitter systems, etc. When you emotionally experience something that's out of your control or feels out of control, you experience distress. And you trigger those same alterations in immunity, in autonomic functioning, etc. Think about when you get upset and you feel shaky and sweaty and all those things. That's because your body's making those neurotransmitters that are doing this, and hormones. So to me, it's no different than thinking about the social environment and how it might get in there and get embedded, biologically embedded. We talk about epigenetics as one mechanism that happens, and but there are lots of ways that happens, and lots of things we measure. And that's what I measure in my PACER laboratory, is the different key regulatory response systems that are triggered by these different collective exposures. And to Bob's point, it really is, we knew 20 years ago we needed to measure not just one chemical at a time, but we didn't have the computational tools in some way to do that on a large scale. And the reason we could come to develop an institute which includes Exposomics, to think about how do we measure the totality, or as close to that as we can, to find the big drivers in a certain patient population group, etc. We now have those tools, so it's very exciting.
It's very exciting. I'm jumping ahead, but I'm assuming you'll be thinking about, you probably have high throughput technology. Will you be layering sort of AI onto that, and just some of the things that we stand on the cusp of or are using?
Yeah, there are some additional challenges to exposomics compared to genomics. So your genome doesn't change. It's the same the day you're conceived as the day you die, but your exposome is changing over time. So it's actually much more of a computational challenge. And it's also a measurement challenge, because you're not sick today because of something that happened this morning, with the exception of getting hit by a car or a virus. Your health today is more likely a function of things that happened to you months or even years or even decades ago. We now know that childhood is really important for adult health, so that there's even evidence that environmental factors that happen when you're a child might actually predict diseases like schizophrenia or even Alzheimer's disease. So the risks of all these illnesses actually have their origins in things that or environmental, but when you were a child. But think about the challenge of that. Like the people who have Alzheimer's disease today, they were born primarily in the 1940s and some in the 1950s. So how do you go back in time to figure out what happened in their childhood that may actually predict why they got Alzheimer's disease today. That's really sort of the real grand challenge of exposomics is how do we actually go back in time to do that. So we're working on some of that. Some of it can be one of our faculty, Dr. Manisha Arora, developed a method that uses teeth. So baby teeth works great in kids because baby teeth fall out because you actually need the tooth. It's not. It isn't it actually something that's done in an instrument in a laboratory, but teeth grow like trees, so they have growth rings in them, and those growth rings you can attach a calendar date, so you can measure chemicals that were in those growth rings. It is possible that if you were doing studies where you had access to brain tissue, so there are studies where people donate their bodies to science. If you could get a tooth, you might be able to reconstruct what happened, when someone was a child. But the other thing that we're doing is we're trying to make maps. So maps go back in time. So if you think about weather and climate, those are actually based on maps, and you can actually see, say, where air pollution was in the 1980s, and if you know where you live or where your school is or where you work, you have some sense of how much air pollution you're exposed to back then. And so what we're trying to do is actually create maps that go back even farther in time. Unfortunately, if you think about the 1940s and 50s, there were no satellites. Sputnik hadn't happened yet. So those sorts of maps that we create today, which often use satellites, are impossible to make from the 1940s and 50s. So that's one of the challenges in exposomics is actually trying to figure out how to map the exposome back in time when technology was relatively primitive.
I want to ask you some more questions around that. And, I'm wondering about epigenetics because there's a historical element, to the heritable portion of epigenetics. But Rosalind, I wanted to circle back to your work focusing on asthma and the different variables contributing. What did you end up finding? The big players that we always think of, various common antigens, pollution, smoking, the obvious, weren't. Oh, and then you layered and then you thought of stress. Were you able to kind of, well, I guess the extraordinary thing is if you pie chart out, everybody's going to have different size pies depending on what's going on.
Right.
But is there anything that you ended up finding relatively conclusive?
Yeah, and the mixture of those things, when you're looking at them collectively together or jointly, may be different in a different population. One you might see stress in a certain community, neighborhood, group, etc., rises to the top there, and you might see air pollution being a big driver over here, or nutrition being a mitigating factor of all of those things. So it's important to measure nutrition as well. Think about risk and resiliency factors. We don't measure just risk factors. We really want to throw in resiliency factors and understand those in the mix as well, because you can see if somebody maintains a healthy diet, and even in the context of these multiple pollutants that they might be experiencing in their environment, you can see it can be protective.
That's absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly what we're trying to do, because that would be very helpful to help put that person back on a healthy trajectory, no matter where they are in the lifespan. Even though we understand previous exposures have impact, but what's your functioning right now? What's your profile look like right now? And can we tweak this or that and help get you on a more refined or a better health trajectory? That's what drove me from the taking care of older folks with lung disease, advanced lung disease in adulthood, to go all the way back to the in utero environment and even preconception to start looking at this and doing this work to be able to prevent, hopefully, disease, not just mitigate existing disease. And sometimes you find that if you only look at the air pollution, it seems like that's the driver. But if you take into account stress, it's only in the air pollution has an effect only in, the communities where there's low stress. In the high stress community, maybe it's more the stress, or there's some multiplicative effect of those two things. And so if you went in and intervened and just, by policy decreased air pollution levels, you don't see too much change in its impact on some of the health outcomes you might be looking at. like
That
asthma.
is absolutely extraordinary. All
Yeah.
right, I want to again. I'll just telling my readers on their show notes. We'll link to as many of these papers so you can do a drill down. Of course, I appreciate it, from the bottom of my heart that you're working on resiliency, because that really seems to be there's an obsession with studying the toxic influence, which can be heartbreaking. I'm sure at times your work has been incredibly difficult, but when you're solution centric, I think that's helpful. And I just want to say that I'm a big fan of the work of Dr. Bernard Hennig out of the University of Kentucky, and he's looked at specifically things like omega-3 fatty acids favorably influencing, the inflammatory trajectory of PCBs. Like, I mean, it's just because of my own background being in nutrition, to see that there's
Yeah.
scientists actually paying attention to, if you eat these things, you can actually offset these inevitable exposures. So,
And we
bravo.
found that for asthma, omega, 3 fatty acid, increased intake in pregnant women can protect development of, against development of asthma in their child, even though they're exposed to some of these other things. Antioxidant intake's another one, because a lot of the toxins that we think about, metals, chemicals, air pollutants, they can be pro-oxidizing. So they're enhancing your oxidative stress in your body. But if you can offset that in some way, nutrition is an important lever. It's something we can do something about. Another
And
resilient, oh, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say, and then I want to hear about the other resiliency piece that's very important, is that it seems to me what you're ultimately saying is that you enter into the conversation, or you enter into the delivery of care in the here and now with the variables that are most impactful. So the past exposures and maybe inherited exposures are a piece of the puzzle, but what we can do right now is the biggest. Is that correct?
Well, you have somebody sit in front of you. What can we do right now? That's where we
Right.
need to take exposomics.
Yeah.
The more that you can know about one's past experiences and exposures and when those might have occurred, the more informed that decision-making process it will be at that time. So it's all important.
Yes.
It doesn't mean we have to be perfect before we start doing that. It doesn't mean we have to be able to measure everything from the past. Bob already pointed out the challenges to that. But we're getting to a place where we now understand we need to do that. So we'll be developing, that sort of information more and more that will be available to us as clinicians as well. But we have to start somewhere.
Yes.
And I'm a pediatrician, so the idea, what's the past for an adult is the present for a pediatrician. So if we understand why particular adults have heart disease or Alzheimer's disease or other or lung disease, what was the antecedent cause of that 50, 60 years ago when they were a child? It helps me as a pediatrician to understand what I can do for this child patient in front of me to prevent those diseases later on in life. So that's, to be honest, the value of understanding the past also extends to children, because I think there's a lot we need to do as a society to help our children, because there's an epidemic of obesity, there's an epidemic of poor nutrition, and I think one of our bigger fears is what's going to happen when these children grow up. So what we think of today as being a lot of, say, Alzheimer's disease or heart disease, it may be 3 or 4 times higher in the next 30 to 40 years, because our children and our grandchildren have experienced things like obesity and learning disabilities at a much higher rate than our generation did. And that's not due to genetics. Genetics cannot possibly work that fast. It is something in the environment. And I think we really need to start to get our hands around that, or else we're going to have a generation of people with really severe chronic diseases at much younger ages than we've ever seen before.
Yeah, that's quite extraordinary. I want to talk about, I want to get back to Rosalind, you wanted to make a resiliency comment, and then we'll come back and talk more about what you just said, Bob, and, how we actually look into that and figure that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think another important buffering system, if you will, or resilience builder is our social relationships. So they counter stress effects. That's been widely out there in the literature for a long time. But they can also counter toxic effects from these other chemicals that are pushing and pulling on the same stress response systems that psychological stressors do. And so we've also started looking into that. And you know, depending on where you are in your life cycle, those social relationships might be a little bit different. So when you're talking about infants, and if you want to put people on a healthy trajectory from very early age, you know, think about the caregiving relationship with the infant. And so we've actually shown in my laboratory that you know, positive caregiving that's measured objectively in the laboratory. When you bring in moms and babies together, it does mitigate the effects of psychological stressors that the mother might have experienced during pregnancy, ongoing stressors during that infant since they've been in the world, and also things like air pollution and other toxins. Because our systems in our body, our stress response systems, key regulatory systems, I like to call them, because I don't want people to think it's only stress that's pushing and pulling on it. It's not only psychological stress, it's these chemical factors as well. So these key regulatory systems, like our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, makes cortisol, which is a big hormone that's very important to us to maintain health. But if it gets out of whack or out of balance, it can go the other way and contribute to disease and disorders. Autonomic nervous system functioning and balance is very important too. But when that goes out of whack, and that can be due to air pollution exposures, it can be due to psychological stress. And so, but even when you're exposed to lots of these things, because we're measuring them at the same time, but you have a sensitive, positive caregiving environment, you mitigate the effects of those toxins. So again, that's something we can do something about. We can educate people. We can, you know, it's so important. But think about your social relationships throughout your life course. Same through there.
And I just want to ask on that question, first of all, it's extraordinary. So good connection becomes like kale. A good connection becomes like fish oil. You know, it's like it has the same mechanistic response. I mean, I love it. Sometimes I will tell my patients that kale, you know, exercise is kale, the new kale. So if you don't want to eat kale, get outside and exercise. You know, you can eat another green veggie.
Yeah, actually, but that's another good example. Absolutely.
Yeah. But let me just ask you, you talked specifically about moms and babies, but I think this would be true with any caregiver. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Whoever your primary caregiver is. And you could think about that in the aged population as well, with the caregiving environment there, marriage, you know, couples, you know, your relationship with your significant other, that kind of thing. Pets, connections. There's so many ways that we bond socially that's so important. And medicine had really gotten away from that. Yeah. That is not something that we talked a lot about in medical school. Yeah. But you see it play out over and over in your own life. You see it play out in your patients' lives. And one of the things that I set out to do in my work is, let's show how it really gets in there. Let's show those skeptics. It does get in there, you're right. And people want to see the biology. And we all do. We're scientists. We like to see the biology, but it does help. And then you can talk to patients. And the last thing you want them to feel is that you're telling them it's all in your head. I'm not saying it's in your head. You know, that you got to be very careful how you talk about it. And I always just liken it. I just say, hey, it's no different than breathing in tobacco smoke or other things that you already know could be harmful, and because it's affecting these systems as well. And so let's think about how do we make that better, you know?
Absolutely extraordinary. There was the Project Ice Storm, Moshe Sef, and you're familiar with that, and demonstrating the emotional stress of that huge ice storm on pregnant moms was as impactful as the physical stress of being sort of in the ice storm in a way that, was more impactful. So the physical and emotional really prompted the same outcome, which was an increased incidence of asthma, going back to your original, and as well as autism.
Asthma, and it's a good example of a natural experiment that you can take advantage of, a natural experience that they're all having, and then they decided they were going to look at pregnant women who experienced that at the time and look at the effects on their children. So we take advantage of those natural experiments as well when they come out. COVID was another one. We all experience COVID. We've experienced that in different ways, and we experienced that not just by getting the virus and that sort of thing, but we were schools shut down, kids were away from their social networks.
Yes.
Parents were balancing much more,
Yes.
accommodating their kids at home and those kinds of things. This is going to be research going on for a long, long time.
Yeah. Any comments on that, Bob?
Oh, I think the social environment is critical across the lifespan. I mean, there's even evidence that if you have social isolation, you're at much greater risk for Alzheimer's disease. And yet it's difficult to understand why we don't really, as a society or as physicians, take that seriously. We're very quick to get genetic tests for Alzheimer's disease, even though they rarely give you any information that's really actionable. Even if you have some of the variants that may cause Alzheimer's disease, they don't cause Alzheimer's disease in 100% of people, so you're not really sure what to tell people other than to eat right and to exercise. And you can develop Alzheimer's disease without those genetic variants. And but social isolation, which is something you can help people cope with, or to coach them to try to actually go to church, go to these social events that may actually get them to interact with people. Those are things that actually can prevent Alzheimer's disease. And yet, as in medical practice, we rarely actually think like that. We prefer actually to do molecular tests, and we prefer to give medicines. And I think if we could think about how we can actually socially integrate people better, I think we would have a much bigger impact on health.
There's a radical reshaping, it's starting to happen in functional medicine. We're small in numbers, but in the, incorporating, group visits, incorporating health coaches. So there's a lot of touch points. We did in our diet and lifestyle intervention, which was hard. It was pretty rigorous. We leaned on nutrition coaches to have, frequent touch points with our study participants. And probably that's why we got some reasonable adherence, that connection, and that contact. So I want to get into, I've got a bunch of questions. I want to talk about your progress work in the progress study. But before I get into that, I want to just think a little bit about this through the lens of the clinician. Some of the testing that you're doing, maybe some of the key historical questions that we want to ask. What do you both think? You're speaking to primarily clinicians here. How do we need to be thinking and analyzing the exposome?
I'm going to actually change your question a little bit, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's a lot of research that looks at whether or not an environmental factor causes a disease. So there's a lot of talk about forever chemicals, PFAS,
Yes.
which are thought to be endocrine disruptors, and we think that they cause type 2 diabetes and ultimately obesity. And that's where most of the research is done. What we really need to think about is there are millions of people with type 2 diabetes and obesity in the United States, and they're getting exposed to PFAS. Mm-hmm. And PFAS may have nothing to do with why they currently have type 2 diabetes. But if you layer PFAS on top of the presence of that disease, what's it doing? They are essentially a vulnerable population. They are far more likely to have endocrine disruption than a healthy, young adult who exercises, who's exposed to perhaps an even higher dose of PFAS. It may not take as much PFAS in somebody with type 2 diabetes to actually cause a disruption of their disease and maybe make them need a little more insulin. We don't actually look at these endocrine disrupting chemicals in people with the disease. We don't look at neurotoxic chemicals in people who have Alzheimer's disease. And yet there may be things we can do that actually may prevent, these chemicals from actually making these diseases a little bit worse. And so what I'd like to see clinical medicine do, and also environmental researchers like ourselves, is actually study the impact of these chemicals and these environmental exposures on people who already have a disease. If you look in the literature, that's almost never done. There are very, very few examples of studies that are looking at the impact of the exposome on people with a disease. It's almost always to see whether or not the exposome prevents a disease and that's actually studying it in healthy people and following them to determine whether or not they ultimately get the disease. I think we could actually intervene in people's behalves if we actually started thinking about whether or not these environmental chemicals are impacting people who already have a disease. And that's in the medical world. That's not in the public health world. But that's really not being done right now.
It's also, it likely affects your response to the treatments that we're providing for that disease. And, we think we understand the underlying mechanisms that cause diabetes and what's going on in the pathology, and we have drugs that should disrupt that and prevent complications. But people respond very differently, and for a long time we haven't understood completely why that is. Right? One might be asthma the same way. Some respond very well to the treatments we have. Then we have these folks that just don't seem to be responsive to unless we get high levels in toxicity from the drugs that we're giving them. And a lot of that is likely to be your exposomic milieu that we need to know something more about, that's going to say, well, this person's living in a high polluted environment. Their diet is this. They have a lot of stress. If we can tweak those things and refine some of these things, they might be more responsive to this drug A, or maybe we have to think about a different treatment in the meantime as we adjust those things. I think that's another way that it's going to be very important to use exposomics in that context as well. Precision medicine. How do I pick the best drug for you? I need to put you in more a holistic, perspective.
Qualia's science team is tackling some of the most challenging aspects of health and wellness we all face, from human longevity to optimizing mental health. Their product design is creative, which doesn't surprise me because it's coming from Dr. Greg Kelly, who's widely regarded as one of the brightest minds in functional and naturopathic medicine. You can check out their full lineup by visiting www.qualialife.com/Kara15 and use the code Kara15 for 15% off your order.
You've likely heard about the longevity benefits of peptides. They're in skincare, supplements, they're everywhere. But not all peptides are created equal. Developed by skin longevity scientists, OS1, which is found in OneSkin topical supplements, penetrates deeper layers of the skin, impacting cellular level biomarkers for visible improvements in lines, wrinkles, and thinning skin. Ready to experience OS1's benefits? Use code Dr. Kara for 15% off your first order at oneskin.co/DRKARA.
And in fairness to clinicians, environmental scientists and exposomic scientists almost never do research in people who have a disease. So there's very little data. I think it's very logical that these exposures would have impacts, say, on diabetes or Alzheimer's disease or autism, for that matter.
Of course.
But there's almost no literature on it. I mean, can you imagine, like, a child with autism also typically has pica, meaning they eat non-food substances, so they have much higher rates of, say, lead poisoning. I can't imagine that lead poisoning isn't making their autism worse. And yet there's almost no literature on whether or not lead poisoning makes autism worse, because you could intervene. That may be something where you could prevent further exposure, or maybe in that instance, maybe chelation, because there's lead poisoning, may actually be beneficial to the child. But that's just not something we've done in the world of lead poisoning. So I used to work in the lead clinic at Boston Children's Hospital, and we occasionally saw children with autism. Actually, we saw them at a higher rate than we'd see the general population because they had pica. But once we would intervene with the family and help them understand where the lead poisoning was coming from so they could reduce the exposure, typically their autism symptoms improved. It didn't cure the autism, but it actually made the patient, their behaviors and their be less concerning and also more manageable for the parents. And that was, that's a real benefit that actually can come out of environmental health and exposomic approaches.
That's extraordinary. So reducing the lead exposure and also did you use chelation in those populations?
Well, if they were lead poison, I'm sorry. I have to be careful when you talk about chelation and lead poison, because I don't believe it's a cure for autism. But children with autism some percentage of them get lead poisoned, and that's a higher percentage of them than in the general population. And for those children who have lead poisoning, I think it would be beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. So just one piece of the puzzle, and you think that, and you observed that. Let's talk a little bit about synergistic interactions of multiple exposures. I mean, then the exposure threshold drops considerably.
Right.
Yeah, so the concept of potentiation, where in toxicology you can be exposed to a drug at a non-toxic level or a chemical at a non-toxic level, and you can be exposed to a second chemical also at a non-toxic level. But when they're combined, they cross a threshold, and that's called potentiation, which is slightly different than synergy. But
Okay.
that is a clear biological process that we see in toxicology, and that can happen in other types of exposures. Is one of the key aspects of exposomics is we're not really just looking at chemicals. We're looking at chemicals as well as stress. We're looking at chemicals as well as poor nutrition. We're looking at chemicals as well as some of the physical environmental factors such as air pollution or climate effects. And that actually can be a mixture that can show that same potentiation. And that's something that's a very different concept from traditional toxicology. And I think what sets exposomics apart from toxicology, which is where potentiation actually was first described.
You really the field's moving towards mixtures, thinking about complex mixtures. And what we're discovering is you might totally have missed an association between, say, an air pollution and asthma or other outcome if you only measure one component. But if you take that apart into its pieces and you look at a complex mixture, you actually start to find relationships there because of this, the complex ways that they interact when they're, and that's real world scenarios. We're not exposed to one thing at a time. It's all this mixture of things that we're looking at together.
What do you think about the influence of certain single nucleotide polymorphisms? I know exposomics, well, it includes genetics, but you're moving well beyond. There's a study that comes to mind looking at asthma in a city population, kids with asthma, and there was a higher incidence of a glutathione. A glutathione null mutation, so they weren't detoxing it as well. Have you looked at that? Do you think that those single nucleotide polymorphisms, certain ones, can be impactful? What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah.
I think you put it into context of the environment and gene by environment interactions with those. Yes, that I definitely think you start to get a little closer to, what's driving the asthma in that case, or other things. But
so I think earlier I gave the example of a genetic variant for Alzheimer's disease. That's the apolipoprotein E4 variant. So if you have the variant, you have one copy of about 4 to 5 times risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, and you might have as much as 15 to 20 times if you have 2 copies of the variant. But even if you have 2 copies of the variant, roughly half of those people never develop Alzheimer's disease. So why is that? It may be that there are environmental factors that also need to be present. So similar to potentiation, if you only have the variant, you don't cross the threshold. But if you have an environmental factor, which might be lead poisoning, perhaps childhood lead poisoning is the other factor, and then the two of those things combined is why you develop Alzheimer's disease. You would see in that scenario that having ApoE4 by itself isn't enough to cause Alzheimer's disease. But if you never measure things like lead poisoning, you just see that half the people develop Alzheimer's disease, the other half don't, and you don't understand what that difference is. That difference is probably some environmental factor that just isn't being measured in the studies.
Or it could be resilient, like a high resiliency, and and really solid lifestyle habits, for a lifetime.
And I would definitely counsel anyone who had the ApoE4 variant that good nutrition and exercise and also social integration are very important for trying to prevent Alzheimer's disease in the future.
A colleague of mine, Dr. Dale Bredesen, has been looking specifically at diet and lifestyle, and in a program that he's developed in cognitive impairment with pretty cool, extraordinary outcome. Makes me think of the BRCA mutation. When they looked retrospectively, I think at individuals with the BRCA in blood that was banked. I mean, the incidence of BRCA-associated cancers was very, very low, decades past. And now it's a shoo-in. If you have that mutation, your likelihood of developing a hormone-sensitive. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and
what changed, right?
Right.
The environment changed.
Yeah.
It's always sort of frustrated me that uh, we do a lot of studies on the genetics of, say, obesity, and we don't measure what people are eating or how much exercise they're doing, which is not an uncommon type of study. Um, it's impossible for genes to generate matter, so it seems as though there has to be something in the environment that plays a role. Plus, obesity, when we were children, obesity was relatively rare. Obesity became very, very common after the turn of the century, the 21st century. In fact, as a pediatrician, I never saw a child with type 2 diabetes until roughly 2004. And I actually will never forget the day when I was working in the emergency room and a resident presented a patient to me who had type 2 diabetes. And I remember telling him, no, he's wrong. Children don't get type 2 diabetes. When I walked into the room and I saw this child, I said, oh, maybe he does have type 2 diabetes because he was quite heavy. And there is something in our society that has changed in the last 30 to 40 years that is creating this epidemic, and it cannot possibly be genetics. Genetics cannot work on that time of scale. It's too fast. And we really need to start thinking about what's in the environment that's doing this. We're looking in the wrong place when we look at genetics of obesity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a particular urgency because we know that there's climate change. And
yes.
Climate change effects are going to change air pollution exposures and the distribution of these air pollutants in different areas. Temperature changes. It also affects temperature of the oceans, and it's going to affect our diet because it's changing the balance between good and bad polyunsaturated fatty acids in the fish that we eat because of the warming oceans, etc. I mean, if you start to scratch the surface and look across these different areas of scholarship that are looking at these things, you start to think to yourself, we really got to get on top of this and understand how these environmental factors are driving it, because it's only going to get worse. So, investing in exposomics and tools that we can use to really be able to do that in a nimble way, right? Not take 10 years to do it, but we can actually respond when we do start to see climate effects and severe weather events and fires, wildfires, and those sorts of things.
Right.
So the time is now to really grow this area.
What are the most, I mean, if you had to pick, your top 3 or 5 areas to really change. I know you talk about ultra-processed foods. You've published on metal exposures. We're talking about lead. We're talking about, the experience of stress. I mean, we're talking about nutrition and resilience. What are the major players here that we need to be focusing on, us as clinicians, with our each N of 1 case, and then more broadly, as a society or as a world?
Well, so it's sort of counter to the concept of exposomics. So it's a hard question for us to answer because we want to try to
They're
measure.
all of them, yeah.
Well, and to Roz's point, it is this large, very complicated mixture, and you also need to sort of layer in life stage. So, if you're exposed to something as a child, it has a different effect on your body than as an adult. When I teach a class, the example I give is if I'm exposed to a chemical that stunts my growth at age 2, it may make me shorter. But if I'm exposed to twice the dose of that chemical at age 30, it's going to have no effect because I'm not growing anymore. And so a lot of the complexity is also the way that we develop over time. And so we need to be able to understand all the different ways that our environmental factors impact us at different life stages. And that's a very difficult thing to do, and it adds layers of complexity to exposomics. So what's important at age 30 to partly address your question may not be the same things that are important at age 2 or age 5 or age 16. And I think that's the
Okay.
complexity of it.
Well, okay, so then it brings us to the practice of individualized medicine for us as clinicians, taking a really good history and teasing out what it is we need to do. That's, I mean, it's validating, to listen to that
Educating
because Mhm.
educating patients, sharing with them the science that these things
Yeah.
are affecting your health, and then validating for them that emotional distress is just as toxic as these other things.
Mhm.
But there are things we can do now. Yes, we know these things are out in our environment. Take a good history. What can we talk about changing that will be valuable to reducing your potential ongoing exposure to these things? And then here are the things that we know can mitigate the effects. So what can we think about with nutrition? Are there ways we could enhance your nutrition? Exercise. I mean, these seems like things that your mother told you, when your grandmother when you're but there's science behind these things, and your social connectedness. And the Surgeon General is talking about how there's going to be an epidemic of social isolation in this country, and it's going to be a big problem, and we need to start thinking about, well, how do we create resources for our patients, help them, and educate them on what the sorts of things they can do to enhance that. And yes, they have huge health effects. Um, you know, don't leave them helpless and hopeless that, oh, here's all these things that you could be exposed to. Well, I can't move, doc. I live in this apartment, and I know there are cockroaches, and there's this and there's that, and there's pollution, and there's crime in the streets. Well, there are things we can do to help maybe get you moved, but in the meantime, what do we do? Here's what we can do.
Right.
But just your validation for them that these are health driving factors, both building resilience as well as risk factors. And I always talk about resiliency factors at the same time because
Yeah,
we know they're just so important.
and there are
Yeah.
things we can do as clinicians. I think we can take an environmental history. I think you gave an example of some of your patients who grew up on farms. Well, there's very good literature that pesticide exposure might be a risk factor for Parkinson's disease. So if you know that about somebody's history, and it's a little bit different than their occupational history, it's what happened, the things that may have happened to them as a child. Maybe if they start thinking or complaining about symptoms that sound like a tremor, maybe you'll start thinking more about Parkinson's disease in that context. So you can individualize, the way you actually interact with patients and get histories and incorporate that information into the clinical care if we understand more about the environment, particularly the environment that happened to them when they were children, which I think right now we don't do a very good job at.
Something you've talked
Yeah.
about, Bob, in the past, and I think is a good idea to think about, is just as we have genetic counselors, we may have to train environmental counselors because of the complexity of it to begin with, to really get it integrated into the clinical practice, and to have those types of ancillary supports where we can do that in a meaningful way, given busy clinician schedules, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So that's
Right.
an idea you've had.
And
You talked
would
about.
you
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
would you direct, so I mean, obviously organics are fairly broadly available in the US, although not to certain demographics at all.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
I
So
know that,
you need to
yeah,
understand who you're
Yeah.
talking to, and either have resources for everyone
yeah,
where you can provide those things. You don't
Yeah.
want to make people feel helpless.
yeah,
But as we understand more and more about this, we need to provide that as part of the medical care. These things need to be. That's why I gravitated more towards public health. Some of the best interventions that are going to help us are really going to be the public health interventions. It won't necessarily be the one-on-one. We have to do both, but we're going to need to improve these environments. How do we build better environments as we go forward? How do we mitigate the effects that we're seeing right now in the environments that we have. So there are a lot of challenges. Well, that's why it takes teams to do this, right? There has to be everybody around the table who's coming at this from all those different levels to really do this.
Talk to me about the progress study that you and colleagues started, Bob, in 2007. So there's many papers have come out of this, much data, and what is it, and what did you guys discover, and what's happening with it now?
Sure. Um, well, it's an observational study. So we've been following children just as they grow up. We started following them when their moms are pregnant with them, and we're looking at primarily things like obesity and brain development and the connection between obesity and brain development. But the idea is that we would do an exposome study. So we've tried to measure the social environment as extensively as we could, mostly with questionnaires, but some biomarkers like cortisol. Um, the chemical environment. So we've been measuring pesticides, metals, plasticizers like phthalates and bisphenol A. We also measure air pollution. So we work with geographers that actually use satellite data to estimate air pollution based on where people live and where their schools are. And so we're trying to collect all of that longitudinally over time. Exposomics is a lot easier to do in children because lifetime exposures in a 5-year-old only take 5 years to cover. In us, it's very, very difficult to go back to the day that we were born. But we've been able to do this, and we're finding that air pollution is very important, stress is very important, and that we're about to publish, we've shown that there is a connection between environment, the brain, and eating behaviors, or at least obesity. Perhaps not so much. I can't say specifically eating behavior, but if you're exposed to environmental toxicants, some of the effects of those toxicants affect the way that we eat food. So they may affect the way that people are impulsive. So maybe there's some evidence that if you're more impulsive, you're more likely to eat food, which kind of makes sense that you might eat food impulsively. There's also some evidence that your moods may actually affect foods. Like if you have a more depressed state or anxious state, you may eat food. So what we think may be happening is there's this literature about environmental factors that cause neurotoxicity in children, and there's this literature on environmental factors that cause obesity, and they're almost the exact same environmental factors. And so what we think is that these two literatures that have been working in parallel, that what's actually happening is that it's causing toxicity to the brain and rewiring the way we are impulsive or our depression state, and that may be changing the way our children's eating behaviors are, and that may actually be causing them to gain more weight when they hit adolescence.
So the underpinning to both the obesity as well as the impulsivity is some toxin exposures
to the brain.
To the brain specifically.
So the brain sort of is mediating the relationship
Yes.
between the environment and obesity, because eating is essentially a behavior.
Right.
And so because of that, we may be craving foods more, and we have less impulse control to decide to not eat.
What are the toxins that seem to be, what toxins have you identified that seem to be associated with this?
Air pollution seems to be playing a role in this. And we're still looking at the data, but air pollution actually is probably having the clearest signal.
Wow, that's interesting. What about the food itself? I mean, this ultra-processed food. I mean, there's plenty of chemicals in some of the things that we actually call food these days.
Well, in Mexico, they definitely do eat ultra-processed food, but that it wasn't something, even though we try to measure everything, it's not something that we actually have good measures on. So I can't say that it's ultra-processed food. I certainly suspect that ultra-processed foods are playing a role in this, but because we don't have a specific measure for that, I can't really say that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You could, I'm here in Mexico in the study, just for anybody who doesn't know that I'm based in Mexico, and the progress study is based in Mexico City, and that's why you're mentioning Mexico now for listeners. But now, just being in Mexico, I can see that, yeah, there's plenty of ultra processed food. I don't know that it's quite to the same extent. It doesn't appear to be to the same extent as in the U.S. I mean, there's plenty of stands here just making food and all over the place, and that seems to be one of the primary ways people eat or cook at home.
It's complex. My personal opinion, this is not, this is just opinion from having been to Mexico many times, is children in particular drink a lot of soda pop.
That's it. Yeah, Coca-Cola
So
is.
they're drinking. So that is, in essence, a ultra processed food, because there's dyes in it and there's very high amounts of fructose in it. And I think that's playing. I think that is playing a pretty big role, actually, in obesity in Mexico, child obesity, at least in Mexico City.
Yeah, I've definitely observed that. So I see more home cooked or home cooked foods here. But yeah, the soda often accompanies, almost always. Okay, so you tracked these outcomes and you've published many papers on what you've identified. You've looked at DNA methylation. You've actually looked at aging and accelerated epigenetic. You've used the epigenetic clocks and identified accelerated aging in certain cohorts.
Yeah, I think one of the aspects of epigenetics that I think ties to the exposome is we have done some work in elderly populations. This was actually done in Boston, where we measured bone lead, and so lead accumulates in your bones. So we could measure that using something similar to a bone densitometer that can actually measure how much lead is in your bones, and we find that there are specific epigenetic marks that actually correlate to the people who have high lead exposure. And so one of the ways that epigenetics may tie to exposomics in the future is it may actually be able to help us reconstruct environmental exposures from the past. There's actually data. We were involved in this consortium that showed this, but it's mostly other people's work that show that methylation of specific genes actually is a marker of whether or not your mother smoked when she was pregnant with you. So, it is interesting to us that epigenetics actually may play a role in actually telling us what people were exposed to in the past.
Right. It may be a fairly non-invasive way to get a history, or it might be like the teeth, looking at the rings and the rings in the trees, as it were. Epigenetics might be able to give you some of that history. Right. That would be amazing. Talk a little bit about the autism exposome. We were talking about that off air.
Well, there is a lot of evidence that autism is increasing. The increase would be counter to the idea that autism is primarily a genetic disease, because genetics cannot operate on that quick a time scale. It is possible that some of the increase is just due to people, or physicians or clinicians, psychologists are screening more for it. But I think what goes against the argument that that's accounting for all of the increase in autism is that it continues to increase. So I think the most recent data is it's somewhere in the range of 1 in 30 to 40 children that have autism, whereas it was like 1 in 1,000 like 30 years ago. So it's clearly become much more common. And so some of it is more screening, but some of it I think is probably real, which means that it's something in the environment. And one of our faculty in the Institute, Manish Arora, developed this method for actually measuring chemicals in teeth, and he's done some work on twins. And most twins who have autism, it's concordant, but there's occasional twins who have what are called discordant disease. So one of them gets autism and one of them does not, but they have the exact same genome if they're monozygotic twins. So he's been able to show that certain environmental metals actually are different in the twin who has autism versus the twin who doesn't. So he's doing work trying to reconstruct the prenatal exposome and how that relates to the development of autism. Some of that work is done in twins, but some of that work is being done in other studies that have been doing in autism. But that's primarily his work. His name is Manish Arora.
Okay, we'll link to some of his work. Also, what metals? Do you know what metals he's?
I know zinc has played a role in some of that, and zinc is a nutrient.
Yeah.
So I don't want to misquote the study, but I believe it was more that the zinc may have been lower in the child that developed autism than
Okay.
the child that didn't. But I'd have to review the paper to
Sure.
clarify
All
that.
right. Well, we'll find them. We'll track them down and link them on our show notes. What specimen did you collect in, or are you collecting in the progress study?
We are collecting all those samples, and Dr. Rohrer is a collaborator in that site, so we're doing some of those measurements. And I'm working with him on that, but that's really something that he's leading.
Yeah. It's
Good.
important to think as you design study research going forward to build biorepositories over time and repeated measures over time, whether you're doing blood, urine, saliva, hair, teeth, many of these. The placental tissue
Yeah.
is very important as well because there's lots of maternal fetal signaling that goes on that can affect both mom's health going forward as well as the child as they
Yeah.
continue to develop. So I think investments in that area need to happen as well, so that we can ask and answer these questions even more rigorously as we go forward.
And biobanks are also a way to get back in time. So one of our
Yes.
faculty has used dried blood spots.
Yeah.
So every child born in the United States gets a test for metabolic diseases that happens. Has to happen within the first week of life. The dried blood spot collection occurs, and it's most public health departments do it for free. Some of them, like the state of California and the state of Michigan, actually save them, and they're sometimes available for research. And she's actually shown that she can measure metabolomic um, signatures in the dried blood spots that actually predict later onset of childhood cancer. So
Yeah. By
that's
screening hundreds of metabolic factors, not just one or two at a time.
Right.
And then
Very
using
interesting.
machine learning or AI tools,
Hmm.
it's necessary to have those types of tools available to do that kind of computation.
So biobanks are very valuable, and being able to have data on someone from when they were a child is extraordinarily valuable because so much of our health as adults is really predicated on things that happened to us as a child. So the more we can actually start to create these biobanks, we may be able to use them one day clinically if we had these sorts of biobanks. I mean, it'd be wonderful if we were to at least be given the option to store your dried blood spot so that a clinician in the future might be able to run a test on it. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
it would be relatively simple to do, actually. And dried blood spots don't have to be frozen. So I don't think they would be as expensive to store as, say, a blood sample would be.
Right. Right. Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. It makes so much sense. What give me a little bit on the cancer exposome, and then we'll wrap up. What's the focus there?
More work needs to be done on exposomics and cancer, but
Yeah.
Bob was talking about the blood spots that are available on kids at birth, and Dr. Lauren Petrick, who's also in the Department of Climate Science, Environmental Health, and Exposomics, she used those blood spots to find to look at risk factors for childhood leukemia, and following kids who went on to develop or not develop leukemia, and was able to use metabolomic profiling to find some signatures there. So that just exemplifies the utility of those spot cards.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
And
makes a lot of sense.
some of our faculty are using big data models of air pollution to look at its relationship to cancer using, say, Medicare databases so
Hmm.
that we can actually um, see whether or not there's sort of co-localization of higher areas of air pollution where people live and higher rates of cancer. So that's another area that
Sure.
we're looking at.
Yeah, more
Well,
work needs to be done. So it's good to highlight cancer because there really hasn't been a lot of work in that area.
so we're in our home stretch. Is there any final words that you'd like to say as we wrap up here?
I think environment is starting to come into its own as a field, and exposomics, I think, is going to drive a lot of that, and I think
Hmm.
it's going to play a big role in our understanding of why people get sick or why other people are healthy. And I think information is power, and the exposome is really about understanding your environment so that you can make informed choices and decide whether or not you want to be exposed to this or to that. Right now, it's very difficult to avoid air pollution. It's very difficult to avoid chemicals and products. And I think in the future, people are going to want this information. I think Exposomics is going to grow because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. Wright, thank you so much for making time for me today. I really appreciate your expertise and sharing with the functional medicine space here on New Frontiers.
Well, it's been wonderful talking. So thanks for
Thank
having
you very much. Thank you for having us. Take care.
As always, thank you for listening to New Frontiers in Functional Medicine, where our sponsors help bring you the very best minds in functional medicine. These are brands that I know, I trust, I use in clinical practice, and I can confidently recommend to you. Disclaimer. This podcast is for informational purposes only. If you have a specific medical concern or if you have any questions, please speak with your healthcare provider.